and we are back. I don't know. I feel like these weeks are going by fast. There's a lot happening, and I'm trying to, as best as possible, remain present in each moment. So, but I feel like I don't know. These the weeks are just speeding by, um, but it's fun. I look forward to this every time, just to kind of talk about creativity, see where you're at, see if I'm right there with you, and um, what we can continue to do to keep the pace. Ultimately, we set out to uh, connect ourselves with our creativity and then lean on it as much as possible. But we're going to start this off how we always start these conversations off with some mindfulness. And it always starts off with just focusing on your breath, 10 breaths. So let's start that now. Yeah, so now that we're here and we're present in this moment, I think we always follow that up to kind of get our minds going. And um, I have I guess we'll call it a riddle for you. This one is what is so fragile um, that it breaks when you say its name? What is so fragile that saying its name breaks it? And I'll let you think about that for a second, and we'll ultimately get back to it. But today's interesting because I'm almost, in a sense, countering what we've talked about thus far. But I want this conversation to be about whether or not we are givers or takers as creatives. Are we givers or are we takers? Like if we think about the universe and everything that kind of comes together to for it to function normally, where do we sit as creatives? Are we on the side of selfishness, or are we on the side of selflessness? And it's always an interesting question, because when you think about like creative people and people who are living in their creativity, it's almost like this. It's centered around the idea of isolation and loneliness. And I mean, to be honest, even the creative process, as we've kind of laid out in previous episodes, is in fact a almost like a selfish journey, right? It's this idea of like leaning into your own intuition, and then your own self-awareness, and your own imagination, right? So it's ultimately it feels like this selfish process, but I don't know. I don't know that it is purely that, because most of the art that comes from our creativity is in fact selfless. Because as much as the process itself is selfish, as we just kind of laid out, I think ultimately what comes from it is in fact selfless. And even when I think back to when we talked about how creativity can be a form of therapy, or it's a survival tool, right? Even those things, it's almost it almost feels like what we're saying is creativity is a gift that is only for me, and it's my gift. But I don't believe that. I As much as we do use creativity as therapy, and it is with us in our loneliest of times, I think it's in those moments when we are sacrificing ourselves, we're sacrificing normalcy. It's almost like an act of um, like as if though you're a martyr per se. It's like you make all these sacrifice because of something you believe in, knowing that it could potentially help somebody else. But I don't know that you're ever thinking about that in the moment. I don't know that it's a conscious thought that this process right here is ultimately for somebody else. I don't. It's rarely do you find creative people that are one admit that or even think or believe that that is actually what they're doing. My take is a little different because I believe that if your creativity is somehow tied to your purpose, which I think mine is, and your purpose is in fact a selfless act, because you know you're living your purpose, you're living within your purpose when you're doing something that is selfless. So we're able to extrapolate from that if you're using your creativity and it's evident within your purpose, and your purpose is a selfless act, we can deduce or come to the conclusion that creativity itself is in fact a selfless act. Mine is what's interesting about this idea of the selfish component to this, right? I've always, it's a random story, but I've never learned how to receive gifts. Like I'm always a giver, but receiving gifts always make me a little bit uncomfortable. And I never really knew why. But I saw an interview. I think it was Vince Staples that was being interviewed, and he kind of mentioned that he didn't like receiving gifts too, and his reasoning was, and I'm paraphrasing at this point, but his thought process was that people who are good gift givers or people who generally give gifts don't give gifts for you, but more so for them. That's why every time they give you a gift, they kind of look at you to see your reaction, and I think it's satisfying for them seeing how you react to the gifts that they give. So it's selfish in its own self. And that's always been interesting to me, because going back to this idea that as creatives we create selfishly, and I don't know that we intentionally care how it's received when we're actually in the creative process. Now ultimately, if somebody or someone benefits from it, I think there is some level of satisfaction that comes from that. So it's almost like selflessness is a byproduct of it. I per se, I've always, like I've said it numerous times, a few times in our conversation, that my creativity takes shape in a form of technology and innovation, and how I design. I use this concept known as human-centered design, where the focus is on the human side of everything. And not only that, I think, I don't know if this, we've brought up this word a few times, empathy is a huge part of my design process, my creative process. And empathy is just seeing things from the perspective of those who are experiencing the problem or seeing the problem. And knowing that empathy and selfishness are contradictory words. So for me, especially in my professional aspect, when I'm called to innovate and to leverage my creativity, it's always been selfless for me. And I have to manage that, because I understand that my creativity is my natural resource, right? And like with anything, it's you don't want to overuse it, but I've always felt like if I have an opportunity to do something great for somebody else, especially with something that comes so easily to me, I always kind of I'm drawn to that. But on top of that, it's like here we are today, and we're talking. This podcast is known as the Creative Conduit, but this is an outlet for NOM, which is the company I own, which is a creativity and innovation as a service ideation consulting firm. But the reason why all of this came together was because when I identified throughout my research and just living within my creativity and studying creative people, when I identified the creative process and then figure out how to create tools and workshops and things that could tools that could connect individuals back to their creativity, I packaged that, and my natural response was, hey, I can get this to other people. I uncovered this thing that has been beneficial to me, and I know there's a lot of me or people like me out there that can benefit from this. So my natural instinct was to share this with the world, and that's how this particularly came about. So I know for me, like when I think of my creativity, I see it not as selfish, but as selfless. And in most cases, I can admit that, especially in I don't know, darker times, or times where it's less of an ask, or less about innovation and just more about just existing. We talked about the therapy side of this, and it's like I do it because of how rewarding that process is for me, psychologically, mentally. There's even a spiritual connection to it, and I don't necessarily take that for granted. I understand how important that is for me, the creative process, my creative journey, what it does for my psyche, for my livelihood, for my sanity. But even with that, whatever generally comes from it, to me, it is beneficial to the people who consume it, and ultimately society. And that is something that I want to continue to be able to do. And I hope nothing changes. I hope that I don't get to a point where I cannot share my creativity, or someone else cannot benefit from my creativity. I think ultimately that's what I strive for, and I don't want to live in a world where it cannot be selfless. There's a few other things I'd want to cover, just because I think when going back to the idea of your purpose, have you ever thought about what that possibly is, and how your creativity ties into that? And for a lot of us, this is another thing that we mentioned, we talked about. It's like our creativity, what comes from it when it manifests. For a lot of us, it comes in art. And also for a lot of us, it doesn't showcase itself in art. But when we see the product of our creativity, how satisfying is it for you? And is your first thought to share it with anybody else? How does your creativity become public? Is there ever a moment when in that creative process you hit that eureka moment where it's like, okay, here it is? And I don't want to say it's finished, because a lot of the times, half the things I work on or whatever comes from my creativity, it always feels like there's some fluidity to it. It's like this never ending thing. It's never complete. There's always some way to innovate or build upon it. So um, when it solves the problem that I originally set out to solve, at what point do I realize that, hey, this might be greater than me? What point do you realize that, like, this is something that someone else can benefit from? And it could be anything, right? It could be a piece of writing, something you created, in a sense of like a tangible object. It made me think of, for I don't think I mentioned it here, but so it'll be I guess the first time saying it. It's like, I'm an inventor. Like, yes, I create a bunch of things, but I'm officially an inventor because I actually built something that never existed before, and I applied for a patent for it, and I received the patent. I'm the inventor of Belt Bar, which is the fashionable fix for belt flap. It's an adaptable belt keeper. So for that flap in your belt, you've used this. You might cut your belt. You might use a double-sided tape. You might fold your belt. But ultimately, the goal is to keep the flap down. And this is a problem that we've all faced. It wasn't necessarily unique to me, but I designed a product that solves that. I remember during that iterative process of designing, scrapping. At no point was I thinking about anybody else but myself to solve that problem. And was I selfish in that moment? I want to say yes, but that's because we already aware that, or we talked about that, the creative process is in fact selfish. But the moments where I stepped out of the creative process, I was conscious that what I was building and designing, what I was creating, was ultimately going to be beneficial to the rest of the world and not necessarily just me. And I was conscious of that to the point that as I was building, I would think about different personas and like individuals in my head and saying, would they wear this? Why wouldn't they wear it? And started challenging myself in a way that because as designers and creatives, sometimes we can get lost in our own head, and sometimes empathy allows us to have out of body experiences, and in those moments, we see from a vantage point that exists in our subconscious. If we kind of, because we're layered, we're not monoliths, so when those experiences is kind of shape how we view the world. But I was able to, before I had other people use it and test it. It's almost like method acting, where I became those individuals that I was building for, and I asked myself, I dressed as just as the people that I think would have worn it, how they would wear it, and I went through multiple different iterations. But I'm saying that only to say that I experienced both consciously. Like I consciously experience the selfish side of being creative and the art that comes from it, and the selfless side of it as well. And it's been kind of evident throughout my entire creative process. And I want to say most creatives feel the same way. I don't know that it's as conscious unless they go into it knowing that, or they're building something that was asked of them. Oh, write me this, or can you paint this? Like almost like commissioned art, commissioned creativity. But the impromptu escape to your creativity is in fact a selfish experience. But I think the byproduct of that, whether conscious or unconscious, is selfless. I think too many of us benefit from the selfishness of creatives for us to see creativity as selfish. And that's saying a mouthful. It's like, even saying it back, it almost sounds like this complex thing when in reality it's simple. Your selfishness as a creative is what makes you selfless. Your selfishness as a creative is what makes you selfless. Yeah, I don't know that there's any other a better way to say it. I think creativity is selflessness. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, it is in fact that. But I don't want to prolong that. I think I always say that at the end of whatever these are, I always say like, hey, I don't want to spread this out longer than it needs to be. So I'll end it here. But to answer the original question, which was, what is so fragile that saying its name breaks it? Silence. Silence is so fragile that just saying it breaks the silence. As always, it's a pleasure to share this creative space with you. I hope you've been leaning in on your creativity. I hope that you've been enjoying the conversations. I look forward to next week's. I think we've established a weekly cadence, so I think it's safe for me to say see you next week, and go be great.